The Case of the Internet Scammer. I was having a dream about two twin go-go dancers doing terrible things to me with whipped cream when my mobile phone started ringing and dragged me back to reality. It was a British voice on the other end of the line. A man. "What time is it there?" he asked. "What do you think I am, a speaking clock?" I growled. I squinted at the clock on the bedside table. It was just after 3. "It's 9 o'clock here," he said. "It's 3 in Bangkok," I said. "That's okay then," he said. "In the morning," I said. "It's 3 o'clock in the morning." "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm in London." "Congratulations," I said. "Shall I call back later?" I sat up in bed, rubbing my face. "That's okay. I'm awake now. Is this business or pleasure?" "Business," he said. "I need help." I always keep a notebook and pen by my clock, so I took notes as the caller went through his story. His name was Mike Tyson. No relation to the boxer, he said, and I'm a fair bit older and whiter, as he was a retired businessman. He'd built up his own sportswear company and sold out for a decent price once he hit 60. I got the feeling that he wasn't exactly short of money. He'd sent his Thai girlfriend the money for her ticket to the UK, but Mike had waited at Heathrow Airport for hours, and there'd been no sign of her. He tried calling her mobile phone, but it was switched off. Mike was sure that something had happened to her, and he wanted me to check the local hospitals, go around to her house, to do whatever it took to find out what had happened to her. It was an easy enough job, so I told him to send me the 10,000 baht retainer through Western Union. "No problem. That's how I send money to Meta," he said. "Have you been sending her a lot of money?" I asked. Alarm bells were already ringing. "Just a few £100 a month," he said, "and some extra money when her father was in the hospital, and money for her passport and visa, and for her ticket." I asked Mike for as much detail as he could give me. "Her name was Meta Honkaen," he said. I got him to spell it for me twice, because Honkaen is a city in the northeast, and it seemed a strange surname. It would be like being called Pete Birmingham or Eddie Queenstown. Not impossible, but unlikely. He had her date of birth, and I groaned inwardly when I realized that he was almost 3 times her age. Alarm bells were really ringing now. "Where did you meet Meta?" I asked. I would have bet money that he'd met the lovely Meta in a go-go bar or a massage parlor. "I haven't actually met her yet," said Mike. "Not in person. We met online." I was totally awake now. Mike had sent hundreds, if not thousands of pounds to a girl he hadn't even met. I was starting to wish I'd asked for a bigger retainer, because Mike clearly wasn't a man who kept a tight grip on his money. I asked Mike to email me any pictures he had of Meta, and to fax copies of any paperwork he had. Then I put down the phone and went back to sleep. The next day, I wandered along to Starbucks for a latte and a banana muffin, and then took a motorcycle taxi to the Western Union office. Mike had been as good as his word, and I collected my 10,000 baht. There was a faxed copy of her passport, and copies of the papers that she'd taken to the British Embassy. And he'd emailed me some head and shoulder shots of her. Meta was a stunner, no doubt about it. Pale skin, high cheekbones, long straight hair. I went through the motions and phoned a couple of dozen hospitals in Bangkok, but none had admitted a Meta Honkian. I checked my emails and there was a message from Mike. One of life's little coincidences. Just a couple of hours after speaking to me, he'd received an email from a friend of Meta's. According to the friend, Meta had been arrested by the immigration police when she was trying to leave the country. There was something wrong with her visa, and she didn't have enough funds to cover her time in the UK. The police were holding her in the notorious Bangkok Hilton, and the friend said that she needed 50,000 baht to get her released, and another 150,000 baht so that Meta could show that she had sufficient funds to travel to the UK. 200,000 baht in all. The helpful friend had included her own name and bank account details so that Mike could send her money without further ado. I phoned Mike, and the guy was at the end of his tether. It was too late to send the money, but the next day he was going to be at the bank first thing to arrange the telegraph transfer. I told him to wait until I'd made a few inquiries. There were just so many things about this case that didn't ring true. I pressed him for more details about his internet courtship. He told me that he'd first met her in a chat room, and they started talking by email every day. She was working as a waitress in Bangkok, but after Mike started sending her money, she'd gone back to stay with her parents in Chiang Rai, helping to support her younger sisters while she studied for a degree in accounting. It had always been her dream to live in England, she said. They'd traded photographs, and Meta had told Mike that he was the most handsome man she'd ever seen, like a movie star, she'd said. And she loved the photographs of his large house in central London, his 32-foot yacht, his collection of sports cars. Her email began to become more affectionate. Maybe she could fly to London to see him, she'd suggested. Maybe they'd get on so well together that he'd want her to stay with him. Maybe he might one day want to marry her. By the time Mike had finished telling me his story, he was in tears. I told him not to do anything until he heard from me again. I picked up a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label and went along to the immigration department on Soi Swan Flu. The chief there was an old friend of mine. I went up to the third floor, gave him the whiskey, and then we spent half an hour talking about golf before I got around to the real reason for my visit. I showed him the facts of Meta's passport, and he shook his head emphatically. My chai, my chai, my chai, he muttered. He pointed at the passport picture. Meta was smiling happily. The chief explained that smiling wasn't allowed in passport photographs. They were taken in the passport office, and the camera operator would make sure that the person didn't smile. Also, the wavy lines that were supposed to run through the photograph were missing, and the surname was in a slightly different typeface to the rest of the wording on the passport. It looked to the chief as if the photograph had been stuck into an existing passport, and the surname had been typed on a piece of paper and stuck into the travel document. The passport was fake. I asked him what would happen if the girl tried to leave the country with the doctored passport. Would she be arrested? The chief assured me that the girl would probably have just been turned away. If she had been a known criminal, then she might have been held by the immigration police, but she certainly wouldn't have been hauled off to the Bangkok Hilton. To put my mind at rest, he tapped the name into his computer terminal. There was no record of any problems with the Meta Honkian. My next call was to the municipal office in Pathumwan. I was a regular visitor, and whenever I popped in, I took a selection of Thai snacks with me. The head lady saw me coming and came over to relieve me of my tidbits and see what I wanted. I asked her about Meta's surname, and she shook her head emphatically. Honkian was not a surname that she had ever come across, and after a couple of minutes on her computer terminal, she was able to tell me that there wasn't a Honkian family anywhere in the country. I waited until late evening before phoning the unlucky Mike and told him what I had discovered. And I told him of my suspicions, that Meta Honkian, or whatever her real name was conning him. Mike was still convinced that there was some sort of misunderstanding. He was still getting frantic emails from Meta's friend, imploring him to help her, and he was convinced that she was banged up in a damp, dark cell somewhere. I told him that I could get proof that he was being taken for a ride and asked him to send me another 10,000 baht. Then I told him to tell Meta's friend that he would send some money to the Western Union office on Sukhumvit Soi 22 the next day. I was outside the Western Union office with my camera and long lens before it opened. It was on a busy road, but I was able to sit at a duck noodle shop with a perfect view of the shop front. I didn't have to wait long. A black Cherokee Jeep pulled up in front of the office, and a middle-aged Assam woman wearing a gold chain around her neck as thick as my thumb climbed out of the passenger seat. She went into the office and spoke to the girl behind the counter. The woman produced a passport and signed a form and was handed a bundle of banknotes. I managed to get a few good shots of her grinning as she counted Mike's money. As she walked out of the Western Union office and headed towards the Jeep, half a dozen policemen in brown uniforms rushed over to her. At the same time, a police car screeched to a halt in front of the Jeep, and 4 police motorcycles pulled up behind it. I took a few more photographs with the long lens, then went over to shake hands with the police colonel who'd planned the arrest. The driver of the Jeep was a Farang in his 60s, a bald head and heavy jowls and thick lensed spectacles. He had a gold chain around his neck as thick as the one the woman was wearing. The woman was crying and telling anyone who'd listen that the Farang had made her do it, that he was the one who prowled around internet chat rooms and sent emails to gullible men around the world. The Farang and the woman were regular visitors to the Western Union office, the colonel told me. And in the last month alone, had collected $250,000 from a dozen or so sponsors. They were handcuffed and taken away. The money that Mike sent was handed over to me, and I signed a receipt for it. I went back into the Western Union office and cabled it back to Mike, minus my expenses, of course. I phoned him when I got back to the office. I didn't take any pleasure in telling him that his beloved Meta was a 65-year-old Belgian scam artist, and the photographs that Mike had framed and hung up all around his house were of a well-known Thai soap opera star. He took it quite well, I thought, and thanked me for saving him from making a complete fool of himself. Mike said that he'd learned his lesson and that he wouldn't be going near internet chat rooms again. In fact, he decided that he'd come to Thailand himself. He asked me if I'd find him a girlfriend, someone who wouldn't rip him off. I put him in touch with a reputable dating agency run by Nung, a good friend of mine. When Mike flew over 3 months later, Nung fixed him up with a few possibles, but none took Mike's fancy. Mike wanted to go traveling around the country, and the girls that Nung introduced him to weren't happy about sharing a hotel room with a Farang they had just met. I decided to play Cupid and went to a beer garden in Soi 7, and after a couple of hours, stumbled across Ryong, a 35-year-old mother of two who looked 25, pretty, and with a good sense of humor. I ran the Mike situation by her, and she jumped at the chance of a free holiday, especially if Mike would agree to take her back to her home in Phitsanulok for a couple of days so that she could see her kids. To cut a long story short, they got on like a house on fire. A year later, and she was his wife, and she and her kids were living with Mike in central London. All's well that ends well. That's what I figure.